Caleb Mercer put the letter down on the table and picked up his rifle. Not because he planned to shoot anyone, not yet. But 15 years of silence had taught him that when something arrives uninvited, you meet it standing up with both hands accounted for. The woman on his porch hadn't knocked. She'd just stood there in the frozen morning with a trunk at her feet and a letter in her hand, and looked at him the way people look at a door they've already decided to walk through. He hadn't spoken to a woman in 4 years. He was about to find out why Jonas Miller thought that needed fixing. If this story reaches something in you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started. He heard the wagon before he saw it. He was in the barn, working a knot out of a length of harness leather, when the sound reached him. Wheels on frozen ground, a horse being pushed uphill against its better judgment, the particular creak of a hire rig from Millfield that had no business being on his private road at any hour of any day. Caleb set the harness down and stood up slowly. He did not hurry. In 15 years on this ridge, nothing that came up that road had ever required hurrying toward it. He came around the side of the barn and stopped. It was Silas Croft's wagon driven by Silas's boy, 22-23, with his father's wide-set jaw and his father's talent for looking like he'd rather be somewhere else. The boy jumped down and went straight to the back of the wagon without meeting Caleb's eyes, which told Caleb something. He hauled out a trunk. A real trunk, the heavy kind, the kind that held a person's entire compressed life. Then he reached up and helped someone down. She landed on the frozen ground without stumbling, which took some doing after a long ride. She was in her early 30s, dark-haired, wearing a green traveling dress that had seen better days about 4 days ago. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and she hadn't fixed it. She looked at the cabin. She looked at Caleb. Her chin came up about 1/4 of an inch, not defiance exactly. More like a woman bracing for a conversation she'd already rehearsed and was prepared to win. Silas's boy held out a folded letter without making eye contact. Mr. Mercer, got a woman here, name of Clara Whitfield, Chicago. She had your address and a letter of arrangement. He cleared his throat. Paid for the ride herself from Millfield. Caleb took the letter. He looked at it without opening it. Then he looked at the woman. There's been a mistake, he said. Clara Whitfield had clearly been waiting for those exact words. She reached into her coat and produced her own letter, already soft at the folds from handling. I don't believe there has. I have a letter of invitation signed by a Caleb Mercer of Sentinel Ridge, Utah Territory, proposing a mail-order arrangement. I have traveled 6 days by rail and 2 more by wagon to answer it. I didn't write that letter. The signature says otherwise. Ma'am. He kept his voice flat and even, because that was the only register he trusted himself to use right now. I have not written to anyone in Chicago or anywhere else in a considerable number of years. Whatever you were told, whoever told you there, has been a serious mistake, and I am sorry you've come this far for nothing. But I cannot help you. She looked at him. Not the way most people looked at him quickly and then away, but straight on, the way you look at a problem you intend to solve. May I see your copy of the letter? I don't have one. Because you didn't write it. That is correct. Then may I speak with you privately for 5 minutes before Eli drives back down? He should have said no. He knew that. He said 5 minutes, and walked to the porch, and she followed him without hesitation, and that told him something too. She handed him her letter. He unfolded it. He read it once. Then he read it again slower. His stomach went cold and then hard. The handwriting wasn't his. His was blocky, tilted the hand of a man who'd never been praised for penmanship and had stopped trying. This writing was Rounder taught by a patient schoolteacher, each letter formed with a care that he'd always privately found irritating. But the name at the bottom was a reasonable copy of his signature, close enough to convince anyone who didn't know better. He knew exactly one man who wrote like that. One man who had enough of his history to put a letter like this together. One man who had been telling him with increasing urgency over the past 3 years that he was rotting alive up on this ridge, and it was a damn waste, and Sarah would not have wanted it. Jonas Miller, who ran the feed store in Millfield, who had been Caleb's closest friend for 22 years, who was going to have a very serious conversation coming his way before this week was out. Son of a... He stopped himself, barely. You know who wrote it, Clara said. It wasn't a question. I know. He folded the letter and gave it back to her. A man named Jonas Miller. He runs the feed store in town. Was a friend of mine. He believed I needed... He stopped again. He was not going to explain himself to a stranger on his porch. He made a decision that was not his to make. I'm sorry for it. You have my word that what was done to you was wrong, and I intend to make that clear to him personally. And to me. He looked at her. Ma'am, I traveled 6 days on the basis of that letter, Mr. Mercer. I left everything I had in Chicago. Something moved behind her eyes, fast and carefully contained. What does making it clear to Jonas Miller do for me? He felt the weight of that land. He let it. Eli can take you back to Millfield, he said. There's a boarding house, Harriet Cole's place, on the main street. It's decent enough. I'll pay for a week's board while you determine your next steps. That's the most I can offer. Is it safe, she said, for a woman traveling alone? He thought about Harriet Cole, who had a talent for making unattached women feel like a problem she was being forced to manage. Mostly. Mostly, she repeated. There's the church if you need. I have $43.16 to my name, she said, and she said it the way you state a fact, no shame in it, no apology for it. No family in this territory. No one I can wire for help. And the people I left in Chicago? She stopped. The careful containment behind her eyes tightened. I cannot go back to Chicago, Mr. Mercer. That is not a path that's open to me. Something in how she said it, the specific way she closed off the Chicago option, not sad but wary, the way a person is wary of something that has teeth, stopped him from responding immediately. He filed it away. Eli. He raised his voice toward the wagon. Wait a moment. Mr. Mercer. Clara stepped into his line of sight, not blocking him, but making it clear she wasn't finished. I am not asking you to honor any arrangement. I'm not asking you to feel anything about this situation. I am asking you to be practical. She met his eyes and held them. I am a capable woman. I kept books for a shipping firm in Chicago for 4 years. I know figures, contracts, ledgers. I can cook. I can work. I'm asking for 1 month. Room and board in exchange for labor. Nothing more than that. After 1 month, if you want me gone, I go to Millfield or wherever you name, and this is finished. Miss Whitfield. And if you say no right now, she said without flinching, I'll find somewhere to put that trunk, and I'll sleep in your barn tonight, and we'll have the same conversation again tomorrow. Eli climbed down from the wagon bench with the expression of a man who had made peace with the fact that this was going to take a while. Caleb looked at her. He looked at the trunk. He looked at the north corner of the tack room roof, which he'd been planning to patch since yesterday, where the shingles had pulled away from the fascia board, and the next snowfall was going to come straight through. Is that roof leaking? She said. He turned back to her. What? The north corner of your tack room. The shingles are separating from the fascia. She wasn't performing the observation. She just saw it and said it the way a person states the weather. You'll lose the whole section if we get a hard snow before that's fixed. I was planning to patch it today. By yourself. I've done everything on this ranch by myself for 15 years. She looked at him steadily. Yes, she said, and there was nothing cruel in it, nothing that required a response. I can see that. The wind hit the north wall of the cabin. The pines moved. Eli scuffed his boot against the frozen ground and looked at the sky with elaborate patience. Caleb looked at Clara Whitfield, at the set of her jaw, at the steadiness of her hands, at the particular quality of her exhaustion, which was not the exhaustion of a 6-day journey, but something older and harder, something that had been running for longer than the trip from Chicago, and felt something shift in the back of his chest in a place he kept sealed for very deliberate reasons. He did not welcome it. He noted it and moved forward. 1 month, he said. You keep out of the main house after 8 o'clock. You do not touch anything in the front room without asking me first. You sleep in the supply room, I'll clear it. You don't ask me about my personal affairs, and I'll extend you the same courtesy. She nodded once. And you tell me the truth about Chicago before the week is out. He let that land. Not everything, but enough. I need to know what I'm agreeing to. The careful thing behind her eyes moved again. Before the week is out, she said. You have my word. He held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then, Eli, help me with the trunk. The supply room was cold and smelled of dried corn and axle grease. Caleb moved 3 crates and an old broken harness and brought a folding cot down from the loft. He found a blanket he checked twice to make sure it wasn't one of Sarah's and put it on the cot. He did not look at Clara while he worked. There's a basin on the shelf, he said. Water in the barrel outside the barn door. Meals at 6 morning and noon. I don't wait. I'll be there, she said. I'm riding to Millfield tomorrow to see Jonas Miller. He paused with his hand on the doorframe. You should come. It'll help if you can speak to what promises were made in that letter. What are you going to do to him? Talk to him. She considered that. Just talk. Loudly, he said. And at considerable length. Something crossed her face too quick for a smile, but in the same neighborhood. I'll be ready before 6. He walked out. He went back to the barn and stood in the cold air and breathed it in and out, and told himself the only thing on his mind was the north corner of the tack room roof. He got the ladder. He got the shingles. He worked until the light started going. When he came in at noon, there was a pot of coffee on the stove, real coffee strong, not the watered-down version he'd been rationing since October, and a plate of cornbread sitting in the center of the table. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at both things for a long moment. He sat down and ate every piece of the cornbread. Clara came in from outside while he was finishing her hair, fully pinned a smear of axle grease on her left wrist. The latch on the supply room door was working loose, she said. I tightened it. I found the toolbox under the bench in the barn. I hope that was all right. He looked at the empty plate. He looked at the empty coffee pot. You used my good coffee. You were working in the cold. She went to the basin and began washing the grease from her wrist. And there's something else you should know. Something in her tone made him set down his fork. When I left Chicago, she said, keeping her back to him, her voice staying level, I did not leave quietly. The man I worked for, the man whose firm I kept books for, he believes I took something that belongs to him. She turned around. I did not steal from him, Mr. Mercer. I want to be clear about that. But what I did take was information, ledger copies, evidence of what he was doing with the company accounts money he was moving that didn't belong to him. She held his gaze without wavering. His name is Garrett Nolan. He is not a man who accepts losing gracefully, and he has enough money to make finding me a serious pursuit rather than a passing inconvenience. The kitchen was very quiet. You said before the week is out, Caleb said. It's been a long day, she said. I decided to spend the truth early. He looked at her for a long moment, at the steadiness of her, at the way she didn't dress it up or soften it or look away while she said it. These ledger copies, he said. You still have them. In the trunk. And this Garrett Nolan is the kind of man who hires other men, she said, to handle things he doesn't want handled with his own hands. Caleb sat with that. He turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's under it, because what's under it matters regardless of whether you want to know. You came to Utah Territory, he said slowly, because you needed to be somewhere that a man like Garrett Nolan would have a hard time reaching quickly. I came to Utah Territory, she said, Because someone sent me a letter saying there was a life here worth coming to. She paused. I am aware that was a lie, but the distance is still real. He pushed back from the table and stood up. He carried his plate to the basin. He stood there with his hands braced on the edge of it and looked at the grain of the wood in front of him, and made the kind of calculation he'd always been good at, the kind that was less about figures and more about the particular weight of a situation and whether or not he could carry it. He turned around. Don't do things without asking, he said. That goes for the coffee, the toolbox, and anything else on this property. You said that about the main room, she said. You didn't say it about the toolbox. I'm saying it now. Understood. And Miss Whitfield. He stopped at the doorway. If any men come to this ridge asking about you, any men at all, for any reason, you come find me before you say a word to them. You don't answer questions. You don't confirm your name. You come find me first. Something in her face shifted. Just briefly. Just enough. All right, she said. I mean it. I know you do, she said. That's why I told you. He went back to the roof. He worked until the last of the light was gone, and the cold came down off the mountain in earnest, and his hands were stiff inside his gloves. When he came in for supper, the fire was going, and the table was set with 2 plates, and Clara Whitfield was sitting in the chair across from his. Not his chair, she'd left that empty. She'd taken the chair on the other side, writing in a small notebook, head bent, not looking up. He sat down. He picked up his fork. She closed the notebook and put it in her pocket. She picked up her fork. They ate without speaking. The fire did what fires do. The wind worked at the north wall, the same as it always had. When he was done, he carried his plate to the basin, rinsed it, set it to dry. The cornbread was good, he said without turning around. A pause. A short one. Thank you. He went to bed. He lay in the dark with his hand on the empty side of the mattress, where it always went without his permission, and he stared at the ceiling, and he listened to the wind, and he thought about a man named Garrett Nolan who hired other men and did not accept losing. He thought about a trunk with ledger copies in it sitting in his supply room. He thought about 1 month, which was what he'd agreed to, which was all this was. He told himself that was the only reason his mind was still running at this hour. Somewhere in the cabin, in the small cold room off the barn side, there was someone else breathing. He hadn't heard that in a very long time. He didn't know what to do with it, except to note that it was there the way you note a sound in the dark that turns out not to be a threat. Just present. Unexplained. Already harder to ignore than it had any right to be. He closed his eyes. He told himself he wasn't counting the days. He was up at 4:30, same as always, but the cabin didn't feel the same as always, and he couldn't pretend otherwise. There was a light already showing under the supply room door. He stood in the hallway for a moment looking at it, then put on his coat, and went out to saddle the horses without knocking. She was on the porch when he came around with both animals dressed and pinned, and carrying the folded letter in her left hand. She looked at the second horse and didn't say anything about it, which he appreciated. She just took the reins he offered, checked the stirrup length without being told, and mounted without asking for help. They rode down the ridge in the dark without talking. The trail took 40 minutes at a steady pace. Millfield came into view just as the sky was going from black to gray, a main street, a church steeple, a water tower, and the particular low sprawl of a town that had been built fast and practical and without much thought for what it would look like later. Caleb had ridden this trail more times than he could count, back when counting had seemed worth doing. He hadn't been down it in 4 months. Jonas Miller's feed store sat at the north end of the main street, between the land office and a dry goods outfit. Jonas lived in the 2 rooms above it, which Caleb knew because he had helped Jonas move those 2 rooms worth of furniture up a narrow staircase 17 years ago and had not forgotten the experience. There was a light in the upstairs window. Jonas was an early riser. Caleb had always found this an agreeable quality in a friend, and was currently reconsidering. He tied both horses at the rail and looked up at the window for a moment. "You don't have to come in," he said. I know, Clara said, and tied her horse and followed him to the door. He didn't knock. He tried the handle unlocked, same as it had been for 22 years, and went in. The store smelled of grain and leather oil and sawdust. He walked through it in the gray light, past the feed bins, and the coil of rope hanging on the wall, and the small wood stove Jonas kept burning through winter. And he went up the narrow stairs at the back and knocked on the door at the top. A pause. The sound of movement. Then Jonas Miller opened the door in his undershirt and suspenders, holding a coffee cup, and his face went through 3 different expressions in about 2 seconds: surprise, recognition, and then something that was either guilt or the extremely close cousin of it. Jonas was 61, with a full white beard and the build of a man who had spent his whole life moving heavy things. He was not a small person, and he was not easily rattled. He looked at Caleb. He looked past Caleb at Clara. He looked back at Caleb. Well, he said. Well, Caleb said. Jonas stepped back from the door. You'd better come in. The room was small and warm, a table and 2 chairs and a cot in the corner, and a shelf of books that Jonas had been slowly working through for 30 years. Caleb came in. Clara came in behind him and stood near the wall with her hands folded and her face neutral. Jonas looked at her again, and then looked at Caleb, and had the decency not to pretend he didn't know why they were there. I expect you want an explanation, Jonas said. I want a great many things, Caleb said. An explanation is where we'll start. Jonas set his coffee down and pulled out one of the chairs and sat in it heavily. He did not offer them the other chair. He rubbed his face with one large hand and looked at the table, and then looked up. I wrote to an agency in Chicago, he said. Correspondence agency handles introductions for people in remote situations. I wrote under your name. I told them you were a rancher, 44 widower solid property, looking to build a life with someone. I described you accurately in every respect except for the fact that you didn't know about it. That is a significant exception, Jonas. I know it. You forged my name on a legal document of arrangement. I know it, Caleb. You sent this woman across 6 days of travel on the basis of a lie. Jonas looked at Clara directly for the first time. Ma'am, I am sorry for the trouble I've caused you. That wasn't my intention, and I know it doesn't fix what you've been through. I thought... He stopped. He tried again. I thought if I could just get someone up there, if Caleb could just have a conversation with a real person instead of those 4 walls. He looked back at Caleb. I've watched you disappear for 15 years. Every year a little further up that ridge and a little further from the world. I didn't know what else to do. The room was quiet. You could have talked to me, Caleb said. I did talk to you. I talked to you for 15 years. Jonas's voice was even, but there was something worn underneath it. You're very good at listening to a man and then going right back to what you were doing. I ran out of talking. Caleb looked at him. He wanted to be angrier than he was, and he couldn't quite get there, and that irritated him more than the original offense. He knew Jonas. He knew the exact dimensions of the man's stubbornness, and the exact dimensions of his loyalty, and he knew that this, as wrong-headed and overstepping and fundamentally outrageous as it was, had not come from a careless place. You had no right, Caleb said. No, Jonas said. I didn't. You put this woman in a position she had no part in creating. Yes. And you did it without a single thought for what might happen to her if it went wrong. Jonas was quiet for a moment. I thought about it, he said. I didn't think it would go wrong the way it did. I thought you'd be irritated, and she'd be stranded, and you'd end up offering her a meal out of sheer Caleb Mercer pig-headedness, and by the time supper was done, you'd have remembered what it felt like to talk to another person. He looked at his coffee. I miscalculated. Considerably. Yes. He looked up. Is she staying? Caleb said nothing. Clara said from her position near the wall, I'm staying 1 month. That was the arrangement Mr. Mercer agreed to. Jonas looked at her with something that was dangerously close to satisfaction. Caleb saw it and pointed at him. Don't, he said. I didn't say anything. You were about to. I was going to say that I'm glad she's staying, and I think you're doing the right thing, and, Jonas, and I'll stay out of it from here. He raised both hands, a gesture of surrender that Caleb did not entirely believe. Completely. You have my word. Your word, Caleb said, has recently taken some damage. Jonas accepted that without argument, which was its own kind of apology. He picked up his coffee and held it and looked at Clara again, with the particular look of a man trying to take the measure of someone without being obvious about it. You came from Chicago, he said. Yes. Long way. Yes. You got people there? Something shifted in Clara's face, quick and subtle. No, she said. Not anymore. Jonas nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he hears the thing under the thing that's been said. He looked at Caleb. You need anything? Supplies, anything the ranch is short on. It was Jonas's way of offering reparation without using the word. Caleb recognized it. He'd seen it before after other disagreements, though none of this scale. Flour, he said after a moment. And lamp oil. I'll have it on the wagon by noon. Caleb moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back. You ever do something like this again, Jonas? Anything like this? We're done. You understand me. Jonas looked at him steadily. I understand you. Caleb went down the stairs. Clara followed him. They came out onto the main street, which was waking up now, a few figures moving between buildings, smoke starting up from the chimneys. The gray had gone gold at the edges. The horses stood patient at the rail. Clara untied her horse and stood holding the reins without mounting. He loves you, she said. Caleb untied his own horse. That doesn't give him the right. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She looked down the main street. But it's something. Having someone who'll go that far out on a limb for you, even when they do it wrong. She said it quietly, not to him exactly, more to the general mourning. Not everyone has that. He looked at her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she held herself against the cold. He thought about what she'd said the night before about Garrett Nolan, about ledger copies in a trunk, about a man who did not accept losing. We need to talk about Nolan, he said, before we ride back. She turned to look at him. Not here, he said. There's a place at the end of the street. Should be open. The place was a small eating house run by a woman named Ruth Adler, who had been feeding Millfield its breakfast for 11 years, and who acknowledged Caleb's existence with the same efficient nod she gave to everyone, which was one of the things he had always found tolerable about her establishment. They took the table in the back corner. Ruth brought coffee without being asked. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup. Tell me about him, Caleb said. All of it. She looked at the surface of her coffee, then she looked up. Garrett Nolan owns Nolan Shipping and Trading. Based in Chicago, but his contracts run east to St. Louis and north to the Michigan ports. He presents himself as a legitimate businessman, and in some respects, he is. But the accounts I kept for the last 18 months of my employment told a different story. She paused. He was skimming from his own investors, billing for cargo shipments that never happened, routing the payment difference into accounts held under his wife's maiden name. Small amounts, transaction by transaction. Substantial amounts when you looked at a full year's ledger. And you looked at a full year's ledger. It's what I was hired to do. Something in her voice went flat and careful the way it had last night. I brought it to his attention privately. I told him what I'd found and gave him the opportunity to correct it before anyone else needed to know. And he thanked me for my discretion. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle. And that same evening, 2 men came to my boarding house and informed me that I had stolen company funds and that Mr. Nolan was prepared to bring criminal charges unless I returned what I'd taken, and agreed to leave Chicago without speaking to anyone about anything. Caleb was still. He tried to buy your silence with a threat. He tried to take my freedom with a lie, she said. which is not the same thing, and I want to be exact about it. I had not stolen anything. He knew that. But he also knew that a bookkeeper with no family connections and no money for a lawyer was not going to win a criminal case against Garrett Nolan, regardless of what the truth was. She met his eyes. So I left. But I took copies of 3 months of the ledgers before I did. Because if I had no leverage and no witness and no recourse at least, I could make sure that if he came after me, I had something to come after him with. Where are the copies now? In my trunk. In your supply room. He thought about that. He thought about what it meant for those papers to be on his property, and what it meant that Nolan would likely be looking for them, and what it meant that a man with enough money to make finding someone a serious pursuit would eventually think to follow a trail. The agency Jonas used, he said. In Chicago. Would Nolan have any connection to that kind of business? She frowned. I don't know. Why? Because the trail from you to this ridge is short if someone's looking. Jonas used an agency. The agency has your name and your correspondence, and if Nolan has the kind of reach you're describing, he could find the agency, she said. She went still. He could find where I went. I don't know that he has, Caleb said. I'm saying it's not a trail that would take a determined man long to follow. And you said he's determined. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her think, watched the calculation move behind her eyes fast and unsentimental, the way a person thinks when they've already done a lot of thinking about survival, and they're good at it. What do you want to do? She said. The question surprised him, not because it was unreasonable, but because of the way she asked it, not with deference, not with fear, but with the directness of someone who considered him a partner in the problem rather than an obstacle or a refuge. I want to know what those ledger copies prove, he said. Exactly. Not generally exactly. What transactions, what amounts, what names. I can walk you through all of it. Tonight, he said. When we get back. He picked up his coffee. And I want to know if there are people in Chicago lawyers' officials, anyone who would have any interest in what you have. There's a man, she said slowly. A federal postal inspector. His name is Arthur Briggs. He was investigating Nolan's shipping contracts for mail fraud about a year ago. The investigation went quiet. I always assumed Nolan managed to make it go quiet. But if the ledger copies show what I think they show, Briggs might still be interested. Do you know how to reach him? I have an address. I don't know if it's still good. Caleb set down his cup. He looked at the table and then at her. What you did, he said. Leaving the way you did. Taking those copies. That took nerve. She looked at him evenly. It took desperation, she said, which isn't the same thing. In my experience, he said, they're close enough. Ruth came by and refilled the coffee without commentary. Outside the window, the street was properly alive now. People moving with purpose. A freight wagon working its way past the ordinary commerce of a town going about its morning. Clara watched it for a moment. Then she said quietly, Was she from here? Your wife? He hadn't expected that. He sat with it for a second, deciding how to answer. She was from Missouri, he said. We came out here together. She wanted the mountains. And you built her a cabin in them. I did. And you've kept it exactly the way she left it. He looked at her. That's a conclusion. It's an observation, she said. You don't have to confirm it. She looked back out the window. I think that's a kind of love people don't talk about enough, the kind that keeps. He didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer for it that he was willing to say out loud. He finished his coffee and put coins on the table and stood up. We should get back, he said. I've got fence work this afternoon, and I want to look at those ledgers before dark. She stood and pulled on her coat. She did it efficiently. No fuss, no hesitation, the movements of a woman who had learned to be ready to move at short notice. He noticed that. He noticed more things about her than he intended to, and he hadn't yet decided what to do about that. They rode back up the ridge without talking much. The morning had gone full and clear, the mountains standing the way they always stood, white at the tops and dark with timber below. At one point, a hawk crossed the trail ahead of them, and Clara tracked it with her eyes, without pointing it out or saying anything about it, which he found unexpectedly easy to be next to. When they reached the cabin, she dismounted and took both sets of reins without being asked, while he checked the fence line he'd been meaning to get to. She put both horses in the barn and gave them water. He could hear her moving around in there, calm and competent, no wasted motion. When he came back through the barn to get his tools, she had already cleaned the mud from both saddles and hung the bridles on the correct hooks, his on the left, hers on the right, as if she'd decided there were two sets of things in this barn now without making anything of it. He picked up his tools and went to the fence and worked until the afternoon light changed, and he thought about ledger copies in a trunk, and a man named Garrett Nolan, who did not accept losing, and the particular way Clara Whitfield had said the distance is still real, as if she had not yet fully decided whether the distance was enough. He thought it might not be. He thought he needed to be ready for that. He went inside when the cold came down, and she had the fire going and the lamp lit, and the ledger's 3 slim-bound book's edges, worn, laid out on the kitchen table. She was sitting across from the empty chair waiting for him with a pencil in her hand, and the particular focus of someone who had been thinking hard while he was outside. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She opened the first ledger and turned it toward him and put her finger on a number. "Start here," she said. This is where he thought nobody was paying attention. They spent 3 hours with those ledgers. Caleb was not a man who frightened easily, and he was not frightened now. But he was something adjacent to it. A cold, focused alertness that settled into his shoulders and stayed there, as Clara walked him through column after column, transaction after transaction. Her pencil moving across the page, with the precision of someone who had memorized every number and knew exactly what each one meant. "This account," she said, tapping a line near the bottom of the second ledger, "is listed under the name E. Whitmore Trading. There is no E. Whitmore. I checked every business registration in Cook County. The name doesn't exist." She turned the page. But this account received deposits from 6 separate Nolan shipping invoices over 14 months, all of them for cargo runs to Milwaukee that his own harbor manifest shows never took place. How much total? She had already calculated it. $11,240. Caleb sat back in his chair. "That's not a clerical error," he said. "No," she said, "it's not." And Briggs, the postal inspector, he was looking at Nolan's mail contracts. The federal contracts, yes. Nolan held 3 postal delivery routes running out of Chicago. If even one of those routes was billed fraudulently. She stopped. It would be a federal matter, not just civil. Which means Nolan would have very serious reasons to make sure these ledgers never reach anyone with authority to act on them. Yes. She closed the second book and opened the third. "Which is why I didn't leave them behind." He looked at her across the lamplight. She was tired, he could see it in the set of her shoulders, now that she'd stopped moving long enough for it to show, but her eyes were still sharp, still working. She had a particular quality of attention that he'd noticed in the first 5 minutes on his porch and hadn't stopped noticing since. She didn't look at things the way most people did, skimming for what was relevant and moving on. She looked at things the way you look when you've learned that the important information is usually in the detail that everyone else decided wasn't worth the time. "We need to write to Briggs," he said. "I've been thinking about that." She set the pencil down. "If Nolan is looking for me, if he's traced me this far, a letter with a Utah Territory postmark goes through the Millfield office. Anyone asking the right questions of the right clerk would know within a week where I am." "Jonas's boy does the post run," Caleb said. "I can ask Jonas to route a letter through Salt Lake City. Take longer to get there, but the origin would be harder to trace." She looked at him for a moment. "You'd do that?" It wasn't a question, but it had the weight of one. "We need Briggs interested and moving before Nolan's men get here," Caleb said. "If they get here. That's not sentiment, that's strategy." "I know what it is," she said quietly. I'm just... She stopped. She picked up the pencil and set it down again. I've been doing this alone for 3 months. Planning around corners, calculating what happens if he finds the agency, what happens if he follows the rail lines, what happens if someone talks. Having someone else think about it with me is... She looked at the ledger. It's a different thing. He didn't answer that. But he didn't look away from her either, and after a moment she closed the third ledger and stacked all 3 neatly at the corner of the table and said, I'll write the letter tonight. You can read it before we send it. I'll write it with you, he said. You know what the ledgers say. I know what a man out here needs to hear to take something like this seriously. She looked at him across the table with an expression he hadn't seen on her yet. Not the controlled steadiness she carried with her like a second coat, but something smaller and less defended. It lasted only a moment before she put the steadiness back in place. All right, she said. That was the 14th day. The days before it had built in a way Caleb hadn't anticipated and didn't examine too carefully in real time, because examining it would have required admitting that something was building, and he wasn't ready to admit that. What he allowed himself to notice was this. She was competent in a way that was rare and specific, and not general to her gender or her age or her circumstances, but specific to her, to the way her mind worked, and the way her hands worked, and the way she moved through a problem as if it were terrain she was mapping while she crossed it. The ranch showed it within a week. She had taken over the household accounts without being asked. She found the tin where he kept his papers and receipts, and sat down one evening and organized 3 years of disorganized arithmetic into something coherent, and then showed him without commentary that he had been consistently overcharged by the feed supplier in Millfield by approximately 4% due to a rounding practice the supplier had apparently trusted no one would catch. She had caught it in an afternoon. That's Jonas's supplier, Caleb said, looking at her figures. I know. I checked his invoices when I was in the store. She set the paper in front of him. You could dispute the last 6 months. He'd likely settle for 3. He looked at the figures. He looked at her. How did you have time to check his invoices while I was talking to him upstairs? You were talking for a while, she said. And the invoices were right there on the counter. He made the correction with the supplier. The man did not argue. Jonas, when Caleb told him, laughed until he had to sit down and then said, Lord Caleb, keep her. Caleb had not responded to that. She fixed the north corner of the tack room roof with him on the 4th day, working the opposite end of the repair, while he worked his, neither of them talking much. She was not afraid of heights, and she was not afraid of cold, and she did not require instruction on how to hold a nail. When he came down the ladder and looked up at what they'd done, it was straight and tight, and would hold through spring. You've done this before, he said. My father built houses in Indiana, she said, coming down behind him. I was the oldest. He didn't have a son until I was 12, and by then I already knew how to frame a window. He nodded. He'd filed that away with the other things. He was filing away that her father built houses, that she had brothers, that she had left Indiana for Chicago before she was 20. And when he'd asked why, she had said simply, more work in the city. And he had accepted that the way she accepted the limits he put on what he was willing to say about Sarah, which was to say, without pressing. There was a grammar to the way they moved around each other that had developed without either of them deciding it. She made coffee every morning without being asked, and she made it strong, and she left his cup on the counter where he'd reach it when he came in from the barn, and she didn't wait to see him drink it. He started leaving the woodpile nearer to the supply room door, so she didn't have to cross the whole yard in the cold when she needed fuel for the small stove he'd let her bring in there, and he didn't mention that he'd done it. When he was working something through a problem with the livestock, a calculation about fencing, she seemed to know without being told, and she didn't fill the silence with talk. She worked in it alongside him, the same way a person walks alongside someone on a long trail, present without insisting on it. On the 11th day, the gelding came up lame with an abscess in his left fore, and Caleb spent most of the morning with the animal's leg between his knees, working the wound, while the horse made his displeasure known in the specific and pointed way that horses do. Clara stood at the horse's head with her hand on his nose, not talking to him exactly, but making a low, continuous sound in her throat that was almost musical and was not quite humming, and the horse settled, not completely, but enough. "Where did you learn that?" Caleb asked, not looking up from the wound. "Horses don't like silence when they're in pain," she said. "Neither do people." He worked for another few minutes. "Is that from your father's place, too?" "No," she said. "That one I figured out on my own." He didn't ask what had given her the opportunity to figure it out. Some things he understood without asking because he'd spent 15 years learning the particular vocabulary of a person who has had cause to be very quiet about the worst of it. It was on the 14th evening after they'd written the letter to Briggs together at the kitchen table. 2 drafts, 1 argument about how much detail to include that Clara won on the merits that he let himself think for the first time, and very briefly that 1 month was going to be a problem. Not because she was a problem, because she wasn't. And that was the thing he didn't know what to do with. He was still thinking about it 3 days later when Alma Prescott's boy came up the ridge at a dead run on a horse that had been pushed hard and arrived at the cabin door out of breath and white-faced. Caleb was at the barn. He heard the horse coming and was already moving when the boy pulled up. "Mr. Mercer?" The boy was 16 now, old enough that he'd stopped being afraid of Caleb somewhere in the past year. He was afraid of something right now, but it wasn't Caleb. "My mama sent me. Said to tell you there are 2 men in Millfield asking about a woman from Chicago. They've been there since yesterday morning. They talked to Silas Croft's boy about who he drove where, and they talked to Ruth Adler at the eating house, and this morning they went and talked to Mr. Miller." Something went very cold and very still in Caleb's chest. "Where are they now?" he said. "Mama said they took a room at Harriet Cole's last night. She don't know if they're still there." Caleb looked at the boy. "You ride back down and tell your mother thank you. You don't say anything to anyone in town about coming up here. You understand me?" The boy nodded, already turning the horse. Caleb went inside. Clara was at the kitchen table working on something in her notebook. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way she'd learned to read it. And she put the pencil down. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He watched her face go through the same controlled process he'd seen on his porch 2 weeks ago. The rapid calculation, the containment of the fear, the chin coming up. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. "How did they find the agency so fast?" she said. It was not quite a question. "The agency likely had a record of your correspondence. Maybe a copy of the letter Jonas sent. If Nolan had anyone watching your boarding house in Chicago, they would have known you left and had a direction." "Jonas." She said his name without accusation. He didn't mean to leave a trail. No, but he did. Caleb moved to the window and looked down the trail. Nothing moving yet. "These men. What would Nolan send?" "What kind of men?" "He uses a man named Cutter," she said. Her voice stayed even. "Del Cutter. He's done other work for Nolan that wasn't legal work. He'll have someone with him, someone younger. Cutter doesn't travel alone." "Are they dangerous?" She looked at him. "Yes." "To you specifically or generally?" "To anyone who stands between them and what Nolan wants." She put both hands flat on the table. "Caleb, I need those ledgers somewhere they can't find them. Not in this cabin." He was already thinking it. "There's a place in the barn loft behind the crossbeam. I keep my deed papers there, the ones I don't want in the main house. Nobody who doesn't know to look would find it." "Good. Do it now before they come up the road." She stood. "And I need you to listen to me about something." He looked at her. "When they come," she said, "and they will come, they're going to tell you I stole from Nolan. They're going to tell you whatever story makes me look like a criminal and makes you look like a fool for taking me in. They are going to be convincing because Nolan pays for convincing." She held his gaze. I need you to know before any of that happens that the ledgers tell the truth, and I am telling you the truth, and whatever they say, whatever they show you, it is constructed. All of it. I know that, he said. You haven't seen what Nolan can construct, she said. I have. I need you to hold on to what I'm telling you right now, even when they make it hard to. He looked at her for a long moment. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her name. She registered it, he saw it, but she didn't move. I've been reading people for 44 years. I read you on that porch before you said 10 words, and nothing you've said or done in the 17 days since has changed what I read. He held her gaze. Put the ledgers in my coat. I'll take them to the barn. She went to the supply room and came back with the 3 ledgers and put them in his arms. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not quite steady, but she held them that way by deliberate effort, and he respected that too much to acknowledge it. He took the ledgers to the barn and climbed to the loft and pressed them behind the crossbeam flat and flush with the wood invisible, unless you put your hand all the way in. He came back down and stood in the barn for a moment and let the cold air work on the heat in his chest. He was angry. He recognized the anger, and he recognized that it was not only on behalf of the documents, or the situation, or the principle of the thing. It was on behalf of her specifically, of the 3 months she'd spent running, of the 6 days on a train and a wagon, to a stranger's door, of the careful measured way she spent the truth, because she'd learned what it cost when the wrong person was holding it. He was not accustomed to being angry on someone else's behalf. He'd stored that capacity away with the other things he'd stored away 15 years ago in the sealed-off place he didn't visit. He went back to the cabin. Clara had put the coffee on and was standing at the window with her cup watching the trail. If they come today, he said, you let me do the talking first. You stay in the main room and you don't come out unless I call you. It's not about protecting you, he said. It's strategy. If they think you're hiding, they'll push harder. If they see you walk out calmly next to a man who isn't intimidated by them, it changes the arithmetic. He paused. You can do the talking after. You're better at it than I am. But let me set the ground first. She considered that. All right, she said. And Clara. She looked at him. The letter to Briggs goes out tomorrow regardless of what happens today. Jonas will route it through Salt Lake City the way we discussed. Whatever Cutter says or does, that letter goes. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that lasts long enough to mean something, and then she looked back out the window at the trail. There, she said quietly. He stepped up beside her. 2 riders. Coming up slow, no hurry to them, the particular unhurried pace of men who believe they hold all the important cards and want the other party to have time to appreciate it. Caleb set his coffee down on the sill. Stay here, he said. He took his hat from the hook by the door and put it on. He checked the revolver at his hip, not drawing it, just confirming it was where it was supposed to be, the way a man confirms a tool before a job. He opened the door and walked out onto the porch and stood there with his arms at his sides and watched the 2 men come up his road. They came up slow and deliberate, the way men come when they want you to watch them coming. The one in front was older, 50 or so, lean through the jaw and heavy through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that had seen real weather and a hat pulled low enough that you had to work to see his eyes. He had the kind of stillness about him that Caleb recognized immediately, the stillness of a man who had learned long ago that patience was a weapon and had been using it ever since. That would be Cutter. The younger one behind him was 25 at most, fair-haired, with the restless quality of someone who hadn't yet learned to be still and compensated for it by working very hard to look dangerous. He was watching the cabin windows more than he was watching Caleb, which told Caleb something useful. They stopped their horses at the foot of the porch steps. Neither of them dismounted. That was deliberate too. Caleb Mercer, the older one said. That's right, Caleb said. He did not move from where he was standing. Name's Cutter. Del Cutter. This is my associate, Mr. Price. He said it the way a man says something he considers a formality going through the motion of civility without any investment in it. "We've come up from Millfield. Understand you might be able to help us with a matter we're looking into." "What matter is that?" Cutter reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. He didn't lean forward to offer it. He just held it, making Caleb come off the porch to get it, which Caleb did without hesitation, because showing a man like Cutter that you understood his games was more useful than refusing to play them. He unfolded the paper. It was a writ of some kind, private, not court-issued, but formatted to look official, with a letterhead that read, "Nolan Shipping and Trading, Chicago, Illinois," and a paragraph below it that used words like theft and fraudulent misappropriation and authorized recovery, and at the bottom a physical description that was accurate to within an inch. He folded it back up and held it out. Cutter took it. "You've got a woman on this property," he said. "Clara Whitfield, Chicago. She left her employer's service under circumstances that require her to answer some questions." "I don't know anyone by that name," Caleb said. Cutter looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has been lied to by better liars and is not especially inconvenienced by it. "Mr. Mercer, Silas Croft's boy drove a woman matching that description up this road 17 days ago along with a trunk. I'm not asking whether you know her. I'm telling you she's here, and I'd appreciate you saving us both some time." "Silas Croft's boy drives a lot of people a lot of places," Caleb said. "That's what Silas Croft's boy does." "That's true," Cutter said. "That's very true." He put the writ back inside his coat slowly and deliberately. "Let me be straightforward with you because I think you're a straightforward kind of man. Miss Whitfield took documents belonging to her employer when she left his service. Not just documents that contain confidential business information that Mr. Nolan has a legal interest in recovering. We're not here to cause trouble. We're here to retrieve what belongs to our employer and bring Miss Whitfield back to Chicago to answer for what she's done. That's the whole of it." "That's a tidy story," Caleb said. Cutter's expression didn't change. "It's not a story, Mr. Mercer. It's a legal matter." "Legal matters go through courts," Caleb said. "There's a circuit court judge comes through Millfield 4 times a year. You're welcome to file whatever you need to file and let the process work the way it's supposed to work. I'll be happy to cooperate with anything that comes down with a judge's name on it." "That process takes time," Cutter said. "It does," Caleb agreed. "That's how the law's supposed to operate." Something moved behind Cutter's eyes. Not anger, he was too practiced for anger. More like a recalculation. The kind that happens when a man discovers the terrain is different from what the map indicated. He looked at the cabin window. He looked back at Caleb. "If she's in that cabin," he said, and his voice dropped just slightly. "Just enough. It would go better for everyone involved if she came out on her own and we settled this civilly. Mr. Nolan is prepared to be reasonable if the property is returned." "And if she's not in that cabin," Caleb said, "you've ridden up a long road for nothing, and you're welcome to ride back down it." Price shifted in his saddle behind Cutter. His hand moved toward his coat and then stopped because Caleb's hand had moved to his hip at exactly the same moment and stopped there, and Price was young, but not stupid enough to miss what that meant. Cutter looked at Price. A look that said, "Settle down," and Price settled. "Mr. Mercer," Cutter said with a patience that was running a thin edge under it now. "I'm trying to resolve this without difficulty. You seem like a reasonable man. You've got a good operation here, good property. There's no reason for any of this to touch you if you simply—" The cabin door opened behind Caleb. He heard it, and he didn't turn around because turning around was what Cutter wanted, a moment of distraction, a shift in the geometry. He kept his eyes on Cutter and listened to Clara's footsteps cross the porch and come to stand beside him, slightly to his left, close enough that he could feel the deliberateness of her positioning, not behind him, not sheltered by him, but beside him, even with him. "Mr. Cutter," she said. Cutter's eyes moved to her. Something in his face shifted, a tightening that wasn't quite relief, because it wasn't relief that drove it. It was the expression of a man who has confirmed the location of something he intends to take. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "you've led us quite a way." "I didn't ask you to follow," she said. "Mr. Nolan asks you to come back to Chicago and answer for what you took." "I took copies of ledgers that document criminal fraud," she said. Her voice was exactly what Caleb had expected it to be, level clear, carrying the particular authority of a woman who knows precisely what she's saying, and has decided to say all of it. "I took them because I found evidence that Garrett Nolan has been defrauding his investors and the federal postal contracts he holds in the state of Illinois. I took them because when I brought that evidence to his attention privately, he threatened me with false criminal charges to buy my silence. And I kept them because without them I have no protection, and with them I have the only leverage I'm likely to get against a man with his resources." Cutter let her finish. He was good at that, letting people say the thing they needed to say, and then continuing exactly as he'd planned to continue. "That's a serious set of allegations, ma'am." "Yes," she said. "It is. And I've sent documentation supporting every one of them to a federal postal inspector in Chicago who has been investigating Mr. Nolan for the better part of 18 months. She paused one beat. "The letter left this county 4 days ago." That one landed. Caleb felt it land the way you feel a shift in pressure, not visible, but real. Cutter's stillness took on a different quality. Price had stopped moving entirely. "You're bluffing," Price said from behind Cutter. "Mr. Price," Clara said, turning her attention to him with the calm of a schoolteacher addressing a student who has spoken out of turn. "I kept books for Garrett Nolan for 18 months. I documented $11,000 in fraudulent transactions across 14 months. I have 3 ledgers with annotated entries signed shipping manifests that contradict the billed invoices and the name and account number of the shell company he ran the money through. I have been building this case since the day he threatened me because I knew this day was coming." She looked back at Cutter. "Does that sound like a bluff to you?" Cutter was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that a man uses to recalibrate. "Those ledgers are the property of Nolan Shipping and Trading," he said. "The copies are mine," she said. "I made them on my own time. I challenge you to find a court that would rule otherwise." "I can think of 1 or 2, Cutter said, and there was the edge now coming up through the patience like a blade through cloth. "Then find one," Caleb said, "and bring its ruling up this road. Until then you're standing on my property without invitation, and I'm asking you to leave it." Cutter looked at him. A long look, the measuring kind. "You sure you want to be in the middle of this, Mr. Mercer?" "I'm not in the middle of it," Caleb said. "I'm on one side of it, and you're on the other side of my property line." He held the man's gaze without effort, because he'd spent 15 years being still, and he was very good at it, and Cutter, for all his practiced patience, was on someone else's ground. "I won't ask a third time." Another long moment. Then Cutter reached up and touched the brim of his hat, the gesture of a man performing civility as a parting shot, because he had no other parting shot available right now. "We'll be in Millfield," he said, "for as long as it takes." He turned his horse. Price followed, throwing one last look back at the cabin that landed somewhere between resentment and uncertainty. Caleb stood on the porch and watched them ride back down the trail until they were gone into the tree line. He didn't move until the sound of the horses had faded completely. Then he let out a long, slow breath. "You said 4 days," he said. "I know what I said. The letter went out this morning." "I know." She was looking at the empty trail. "If he searches Millfield tomorrow and finds nothing, he'll think the letter is already moving. By the time he works out the timing, it will be." He turned to look at her. She was still watching the place where they'd disappeared. Her arms crossed against the cold, her jaw set. "You lied to Del Cutter's face," he said. "I told him a version of the truth that served our purposes better than the full version," she said. She glanced at him sideways. "You told him you didn't know my name." "Fair point," he said. She almost smiled. Then she didn't, because there was nothing quite smile-worthy about the situation yet. "They won't leave Millfield," she said. "Cutter isn't a man who leaves when he's told to leave. He'll wait, he'll watch, and when he decides the legal route is taking too long, he'll try something else." "What kind of something else?" She looked at him directly. "The kind that happens at night," she said. "The kind that's hard to prove." He thought about the barn, about the ledgers behind the crossbeam. "We need the sheriff," he said. "Will he help?" "Tom Hadley's been sheriff in Millfield for 12 years, Caleb said. "He's not Nolan's sheriff. He's nobody's sheriff except his own." He paused. "He and I don't have much occasion to talk, but he's a fair man. If I come to him with what you've got in those ledgers and tell him there are men in his town with possible intentions toward a woman on my property, he'll take it seriously." "They haven't done anything yet," she said. "Legally, they've done nothing." "Not yet," Caleb said. "But Hadley can make their stay in Millfield very uncomfortable, and men like Cutter prefer to operate without that kind of attention." He pulled his coat tighter against the cold that was coming down now off the ridge. "I'll ride down in the morning." "I should come." "No." He said it without room in it. "If Cutter sees you in town, it gives him options he doesn't have while you're up here. You stay. I'll take copies of the ledger entries, the clearest ones the E. Whitmore account, and show Hadley what we're dealing with." She thought about this. He could see her working through it, checking for the argument she hadn't considered the angle he'd missed. "Take the shipping manifests too," she said. "The ones that contradict the invoices. Those are the simplest to explain, and the hardest to dismiss." "All right." "And Caleb." He looked at her. "Be careful how you talk to Hadley about me. Small towns?" She stopped. "I don't know what Cutter has already said about me in Millfield. He's had a day and a half. He may have already built something." He hadn't thought about that. He thought about it now. "Jonas will know," he said. "I'll stop at the feed store first." She nodded. She looked tired in a way she hadn't let show all day the particular exhaustion of a person who has held everything together through an event that required holding everything together and is now allowing themselves to feel how much that cost. "Go inside," he said. "It's getting cold." She looked at him for a moment as if she was going to say something else. Then she went inside without saying it, and he stood on the porch alone for a while, listening to the wind work its way through the pines, looking at the trail that was empty now, and wouldn't stay that way. He didn't sleep much that night. He lay in the dark and ran through what he knew and what he didn't know, and what the distance between those two things might cost. He knew Cutter was in Millfield. He knew the letter to Briggs was real and moving, not a bluff, and that Briggs receiving it was the best scenario available, the one that turned this from a situation where Nolan had all the leverage into a situation where nobody did, which was the closest thing to safety they were likely to get. He knew Clara had been right about everything she'd told him because he had read the ledgers himself, and there was no reading them that led anywhere except to the same conclusion she'd drawn 18 months ago in a Chicago office while a man she worked for assumed she wasn't paying attention. What he didn't know was how long Cutter would wait before deciding that waiting wasn't working. He was up before 4. He had the horses saddled before 5. He was about to go back to the cabin to tell Clara he was leaving when she came out of the supply room door, already dressed, carrying a leather satchel with the relevant ledger pages folded inside. She held it out to him. The E. Whitmore entries are marked with a pencil line at the top. The manifests are behind them in order by date. He took the satchel. "I'll be back before dark." "I know," she said. She said it without drama, matter of fact, and then she put her hands in her coat pockets and looked at him in the early dark, with the lantern light from the supply room door falling across her face. "Tell Jonas I said thank you. For the flower." He looked at her. "The flower." "He sent twice what you asked for," she said. "I noticed." He hadn't noticed. He put the satchel in his saddlebag and mounted and rode down the trail while the sky was still dark, and he thought about how she noticed things, and how she had noticed the roof from the porch on the first day, and the invoices on Jonas's counter, and the doubled flour, and how she had spent her whole life paying the kind of attention that most people couldn't be bothered to pay, and had been punished for it by a man who preferred his employees not to see too clearly. Jonas was unlocking the store when Caleb arrived. He took one look at Caleb's face and held the door open. "Tell me," he said. Caleb told him. Jonas listened with the particular quality of attention that he'd always had, fully, without interruption, without planning his response while you were still talking. When Caleb finished, Jonas sat on the edge of the counter and rubbed his beard and looked at the floor. "Cutter talked to Ruth Adler yesterday afternoon," he said. "Told her Clara had stolen from her employer in Chicago. Ruth's a fair woman, but she talks, and by supper it was around that there was a Chicago thief living on your property." Caleb felt the anger move through him clean and cold. What did people say? Most people didn't say much. Millfield's not a town that rushes to judgment on strangers. Jonas looked up. But Mrs. Harriet Cole said it didn't surprise her, and you know how far Harriet's opinion travels. Hadley hear it. Hadley hears everything, Jonas said. Whether he's acted on it, I don't know. I'm going to see him now. Can you put together what you know of the letter you wrote, your own words, what you arranged, what the agency in Chicago confirmed back to you? I need Hadley to understand that Clara came here legitimately, that there's a documented chain. I'll write it out right now, Jonas said. He was already moving to find paper. And Caleb. He stopped. He turned around with the paper in his hand and looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who has carried something a long time and is deciding whether now is the moment to set it down. I'm sorry. For all of it. I know I keep saying that. You keep saying it, Caleb said, because it keeps being true. He paused at the door. But Jonas. Write it out. Tom Hadley's office was at the south end of the main street, a square building with a single cell at the back that hadn't held anyone in 3 months. Hadley himself was at his desk when Caleb came in, a thick-necked man in his late 50s with a white mustache and the unhurried quality of a man who had seen enough in 12 years to know that most things could wait 5 minutes for a cup of coffee. He poured one for Caleb without asking and looked at the satchel. Figured you'd be in, he said. You heard. Cutter came to see me yesterday evening, Hadley said. Told me there was a woman on your property who'd stolen company documents from her employer in Chicago and that he had authorization to recover them and her. He looked at Caleb steadily. I told him authorization from a private citizen in Illinois was not the same as authorization from me, and that if he intended to remove any person from this county, he needed to come back with something I could read a judge's name on. What did he say? He said he appreciated my professionalism. Hadley's mustache moved in a way that was not quite a smile. Which is what a man says when he's deciding how to go around you. He nodded at the satchel. What have you got? Caleb opened the satchel and laid the ledger pages on the desk. He laid Jonas's written account beside them. He sat down and walked Hadley through it, the same way Clara had walked him through it, transaction by transaction. Whitmore, $11,000, 14 months, the shell account, the manifest that contradicted the invoices. He was not a naturally detailed man, but he had learned detail at that kitchen table in lamplight, and he didn't lose the thread once. Hadley listened. He looked at the pages. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise, both of them answered by what was in front of him. When Caleb was done, Hadley sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. This woman, he said. Clara Whitfield. Yes. She your... He stopped. She's living on your property. She's working the ranch, Caleb said. She came under circumstances that were complicated. She's been on the ridge 17 days. She is not what Cutter says she is. Hadley looked at him for another moment. No, he said. I don't imagine she is. He picked up the top ledger page and looked at it again. I'll pay Cutter and Price a visit this morning. Make clear that I'm aware of their presence and their intentions, and that any action they take in this county is going to have my full attention." He set the page down. "That'll hold them for a few days. Maybe a week. Men like Cutter don't like being watched. And after a week depends on whether that letter reaches Chicago, and whether this Briggs has any appetite left for Nolan." Hadley looked at him straight. "If he does, and if he moves, then Cutter has no reason to be here anymore, because Nolan's going to have bigger problems than a set of ledger copies." He paused. "And if Briggs doesn't move, then we deal with what comes," Caleb said. Hadley nodded slowly. "You armed up there. Always. Keep it that way." He started to stack the pages to hand back and then stopped. "Can I keep these, the copies?" Caleb thought about it. He thought about what Clara would say, and then he thought about what Clara would actually say if she'd been sitting in this office for the last 20 minutes, listening to Tom Hadley ask his two precise questions and look at the ceiling and come to his own conclusions. "Yes," he said. "Keep them." He rode back up the ridge, in the middle of the day, with the satchel lighter and the situation no less dangerous but differently shaped, and he found Clara on the tack room roof doing a secondary repair on a section he hadn't gotten to, yet moving with the confident, unhurried competence that he had stopped being surprised by 3 days ago and had started without meaning to relying on. She came down when she heard the horse. She looked at his face. "Hadley's on our side," he said. She let out a breath, slow and controlled but real. "And the ledger copies. He has them now." She went still. "You gave him—" "He's the right person to have them," Caleb said. "Think it through." She thought it through. He watched her do it, watched her check every angle, and when she was done, she looked at him with an expression he'd seen only a few times in 17 days, the one that showed up when she found something she hadn't expected to find. "Yes," she said. "All right, yes." He dismounted. He led the horse toward the barn, and she walked beside him, and the afternoon was cold and clear, and the pines were doing what they always did, and the ridge was quiet, the way it was always quiet up here, which was to say, not silent, but settled. The particular settled quality of a place that had no reason to hurry. He didn't notice when he'd started finding that quality restful again, rather than just familiar. He suspected it had happened around the time someone started making the coffee strong. That evening, she cooked a proper supper, beans and salt pork and biscuits that were better than anything he'd made for himself in 3 years, and they ate the way they'd been eating all week, without much talk. But the silence had changed. It had gone from the careful silence of two people navigating the terms of an arrangement to something else. Something with less border to it, and he was aware of that change the way you're aware of a temperature shift, not dramatically, just undeniably. When she cleared the plates, she paused at the basin and said without turning around, "Do you think Briggs will come?" "I think a federal inspector who's been building a case for 18 months and suddenly receives annotated ledger copies documenting exactly what he's been looking for is going to be very motivated," Caleb said. "And if he comes, it ends." "The legal part of it ends," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. He heard her set the plate in the basin. "And then I'll have no reason to stay," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. "That was the arrangement," he said. 1 month. She didn't say anything else. She dried her hands and went to the supply room and closed the door, and Caleb sat at the table in the lamplight for a long time, looking at the 2 plates drying side by side at the basin, and thought about the word arrangement, and whether it still meant what it had meant 17 days ago on a cold porch with a letter in his hand that wasn't his. He thought it might not mean the same thing at all anymore. He didn't know what to do with that yet. But he stopped pretending he hadn't noticed it, and that was something. That was more than he'd allowed himself in a long time. Outside, somewhere down the dark trail, Del Cutter was in a room at Harriet Cole's boarding house, making calculations of his own. And above the barn, behind a crossbeam, 3 ledgers waited for the world to catch up to what was written in them. 3 days after Caleb rode to see Tom Hadley, the fire started. He smelled it before he saw it, that particular sharpness of burning pine and hay, that cuts through a cold night in a way that nothing else does. He was out of bed and pulling on his boots before he was fully awake, moving on instinct, the way a man moves when his body has learned that hesitation costs more than speed. He came out the cabin door, and the barn was already lit along the east wall, orange climbing fast in the dry timber, and the horses were screaming. "Clara!" He didn't shout it. He said it once loud and flat, the way you say something you need heard immediately, and she was out of the supply room door in 10 seconds in her coat and boots, and she took one look at the barn and said, "The horses," and was already running. "Get back," he started. She didn't. She went through the barn door low and fast, and he went in after her, because there was nothing else to do. The east wall was fully involved now, the fire eating up the old timber with the greedy speed of something that had been waiting for its chance. The smoke was thick and hot, and he could hear one of the horses kicking at its stall door with the desperate force of an animal that knows exactly how bad this is. Clara reached the gelding stall first. She had the latch up and was inside before he got there, her face against the horse's neck, making the sound she made, the low continuous sound, and the gelding was trembling in every muscle, but he let her lead him. Caleb got to the mare's stall and had her out in 30 seconds, and they came through the barn door together into the cold air, and he tied both horses to the rail post 20 yards out and turned around. The east wall was gone. The fire had the roof now. Clara was standing at the barn door looking in, and he grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "It's gone," he said. "Get back." She let him pull her. They stood together at the rail, with the horses trembling between them, and watched the barn go. There was nothing to do. The water barrel was on the other side of the fire, and the well was too far, and he had no bucket brigade and no neighbors close enough to matter. He watched the barn that he had built with his own hands 22 years ago go to orange and black and sparks rising into the night sky, and he felt the loss of it move through him clean and total the way a real loss moves. And then he set it aside because there were more immediate calculations to make. The ledgers. He turned without a word and ran back toward the barn. Clara caught his arm. "Caleb." "The crossbeam," he said. She understood immediately. She let go of his arm and ran with him, not in front of him, beside him, and they went in through the barn door that was still clear, the fire having moved east and north, and he went up the loft ladder with the heat pressing down from above and reached into the space behind the crossbeam. The ledgers were there. He pulled them out. He came back down the ladder with them against his chest, and they went out through the door, and the roof came down behind them, 15 seconds later, with a sound like a wave breaking, and the sparks went up into the dark in a column that could have been seen from Millfield. He stood in the cold air with the 3 ledgers held against him and looked at what was left of his barn. Clara was looking at him. Not at the barn, at him. "I'm all right," he said. "I know," she said. She reached out and touched the edge of the top ledger just briefly, making sure they were real. "Caleb, this wasn't an accident." "No," he said. "It wasn't." He thought about Cutter. He thought about Hadley's words. Men like Cutter don't like being watched, and he thought about what a man does when being watched makes the direct approach too costly and the waiting too slow. He burns the thing you're protecting. He makes you scramble. He makes you spend your energy on the fire, so that when the real move comes, you're tired and you've got your back to him. "Get inside," he said. "Both of us. Right now." They went in. He put the ledgers on the kitchen table. He locked the front door and checked the back, and then stood at the window and looked out at the burning barn, and beyond it, at the trail that was too dark to read. Clara stood beside him, without touching him, looking at the same dark. "He'll come tonight," she said, "while we're distracted." "Maybe not him personally," Caleb said. "Price more likely. Cutter's too smart to be on the property himself." "What do we do?" He looked at her. "We wait," he said. "And we don't open that door for anyone except Tom Hadley." She nodded. She went to the kitchen and came back with the small revolver she'd had in her trunk. He'd known it was there. He hadn't asked about it. They'd had an implicit understanding, and she sat in the chair by the window with it in her lap. And he sat in the chair across from her, with his rifle across his knees, and they waited. The barn burned itself down to coals over the next 2 hours. The horses had stopped trembling and stood at the rail post in the dark. The cabin was quiet. Outside, the only sound was the wind and the occasional pop and settle of the cooling timber. Price came at 3 in the morning. Caleb heard him on the porch, one footstep placed too carefully, the sound of someone who had practiced being quiet and was almost good at it. He put his hand on Clara's arm without a word, and she went still, and he moved to the door. He didn't open it. "I know you're out there," he said through the door in a normal conversational voice. "You've got about 30 seconds to get off this porch before I open this door, and we have a different kind of conversation." Silence. 20 seconds, Caleb said. The footstep again retreating this time, and then the sound of someone dropping off the porch into the yard and moving fast away from the cabin, and then nothing. Clara let out a slow breath. "Will he come back tonight?" she said. "No," Caleb said. "He knows we're awake and armed and expecting it. Cutter'll pull him back and think about it and try something else." He moved to the window. "But we're done waiting. I'm going to Hadley at first light." "Then I'm coming," she said, and this time he didn't argue. They rode at dawn, leaving the horses at Jonas's barn, because Jonas was already on the porch when they arrived, which meant the fire had been visible from the valley, and people had been up through the night watching it. Jonas took one look at both of them and opened the barn without a word and took their horses and said, "Hadley's office. He's already there. Alma Prescott's boy rode down at 2 in the morning." Hadley was indeed already there, along with a deputy. Caleb didn't know well, a young man named Garrett. Not that Garrett, who had the alert quality of someone who hadn't slept either. Hadley looked at Clara directly when they came in, which told Caleb that Hadley had spent the last few hours making his own assessments, and then he looked at the ledgers Caleb set on his desk. "Price," Caleb said. "On my porch at 3 this morning." "I know," Hadley said. "He's at the boarding house. He came in about 3:30, and I had Morrison here watching Cole's place from across the street, because I had a feeling." He looked at his deputy. "Morrison." "Price came in with mud on his boots and pine ash on his coat," Morrison said. "And he wasn't carrying what he went out with, which based on his coat pocket was something about the size of a quart bottle." "Kerosene," Clara said quietly. "That'd be my guess," Morrison said. Hadley looked at Cutter, who was sitting in the chair in the corner of the office that Caleb now noticed had been occupied for some time. Cutter's face was showing something it hadn't shown on the porch 3 days ago. Not fear exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has overplayed a hand he believed was unbeatable and is now doing the arithmetic on what that cost him. "Mr. Cutter," Hadley said, "you want to tell me about the fire on Mr. Mercer's property last night?" "I was in my room all night," Cutter said. "You can ask Mrs. Cole." "I intend to," Hadley said. "I also intend to ask her what time Mr. Price came in, which my deputy here can already answer." He looked at Cutter with the flat, patient look of a man who has had this kind of conversation before and knows how it ends. "Arson is a serious offense in this territory, Mr. Cutter. So is trespassing with evident intent. So is intimidation of a private citizen in the furtherance of unlawful coercion, which is what a judge is going to call what you've been doing up on that ridge." He let that sit. "Now, you can talk to me here where I can still influence how this shapes up for you. Or I can lock you in that cell and write to the circuit judge and you can explain yourself to him when he comes through in 6 weeks." Cutter was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the ledgers on Hadley's desk with the expression of a man who has just understood the full shape of what he's walked into. "Nolan told me the documents were stolen property," he said. "I'm sure he did," Clara said. She was standing to Caleb's left, slightly forward, the same positioning as the porch. "Did he tell you what they document?" Cutter said nothing. He hired you to recover evidence of a federal crime, she said. Which makes your recovery efforts a federal matter too, Mr. Cutter. I imagine you didn't know that when you took the job, but you know it now. Something in Cutter's face shifted. He was not a man who frightened easily. Caleb had read that correctly on the first day, but he was a man capable of recognizing when a situation had become something other than what he'd been told it was. He looked at Hadley. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man revising his understanding of who he'd been sent to retrieve. "What do you want from me?" he said. "A written account," Hadley said. "What Nolan hired you for, what instructions you were given, what Price did last night, signed and witnessed." He paused. "In exchange for which I have some discretion about what charges to pursue locally and what to forward to federal jurisdiction." It took Cutter 3 minutes to decide. Caleb thought that was relatively fast given the circumstances, and said so to Clara in a low voice, and she said, "He's been doing this long enough to know when a room has turned against him." And Caleb said, "So have you." And she looked at him sideways, with something that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to be worth noticing. Cutter wrote his account. Morrison witnessed it. Hadley locked Price in the cell on the arson charge. The ash on his coat was enough for a start, and walked Cutter to the edge of town personally and told him the next time he saw him in Millfield County, he'd be in the other cell. It was not yet 9 in the morning. Jonas had made coffee and brought it to Hadley's office because Jonas had a talent for appearing with exactly what was needed at the moment it was needed, which was something Caleb had taken for granted for 22 years and was reconsidering now with more active appreciation. They stood in Hadley's office with their cups, and Hadley laid out what would happen next. The arson charge against Price would hold Cutter's written account, would go to the federal court in Salt Lake City, along with the ledger copies, and Hadley would write personally to Arthur Briggs at the Postal Inspection Office in Chicago to confirm that documentation had arrived and was in the hands of county and federal authorities in Utah Territory. "That changes Nolan's position considerably," Clara said. "It does," Hadley agreed. "A man can threaten a woman traveling alone. He can send men after ledger copies held by a private citizen on a remote ranch. He cannot easily threaten a county sheriff and a federal court without consequences that cost more than whatever he was protecting." He looked at her directly. "You did good work, Miss Whitfield. What you put together in those ledgers, that's not easy to do, and it's not easy to hold on to when someone's pushing hard against you." Clara absorbed that without deflecting it, which Caleb had noticed she did with compliments, the same way she did with most things. She took what was true and set aside what wasn't, and didn't make a performance of either. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, "for taking this seriously." "Evidence is evidence," Hadley said. "Doesn't matter where it comes from." They walked out of Hadley's office into the main street of Millfield, which was going about its morning with the complete indifference of a town that did not know it had been the site of something important. Clara stopped on the board sidewalk and turned her face up to the sky for a moment. Just a moment, eyes closed the way a person does when they need to confirm that the air outside a closed room is still the same air. Caleb stood beside her and waited. She opened her eyes. "It's not over," she said. "Nolan still has lawyers. He still has money. The federal process takes time." "It takes time," he agreed. "But it's moving now, and it's moving with official weight behind it. He can't make it stop without making himself more visible than he wants to be." "No," she said. "He can't." She looked down the street. "I should be thinking about next steps. What I do from here. Where I—" She stopped. He looked at her profile. "The month isn't up yet," he said. She turned to look at him. "You said 1 month," he said. "You've got 12 days. She looked at him steadily, the way she'd looked at him that first day on the porch, reading the situation for what it actually was, rather than what she'd been told to expect. "The arrangement was room and board in exchange for labor," she said carefully. "Under the circumstances of a lie. The circumstances have changed," he said. "The arrangement doesn't have to." "What are you saying, Caleb?" He was not a man who spoke about the things he was feeling while he was feeling them. He had built an entire life around not doing that. He was aware of this about himself. The same way he was aware of the north wall of the cabin. It was a structural feature, it had been there a long time, and working around it had become so automatic, he rarely noticed the effort anymore. He noticed it now. "I'm saying the barn needs rebuilding," he said. "And the ranch accounts are in better order than they've been in 3 years. And I've been making bad coffee for 15 years, and apparently I didn't know it." He looked at her. "I'm saying that 1 month was an arrangement made by a man who was certain he didn't need anything from anyone. And I'm not certain of that anymore." She was quiet for a moment. The street moved around them, horses and voices, and the ordinary sounds of a town in the middle of its day. "I'm not the woman in that letter," she said. "The one Jonas invented. I'm not soft, and I'm not uncomplicated, and I have a federal case pending, and a man in Chicago who may decide the fight isn't over." "I know who you are," he said. "I've been watching you for 17 days. I know exactly who you are. And," he looked at her, "and I'm asking you to stay. Not for a month. Not under arrangement. I'm asking you to stay because this ranch is better with you on it, and because you've got nowhere better to go, and because—" He stopped. He started again. "Because that chair across from mine at the table is yours now. It has been for 2 weeks. I'd like it to stay that way." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't look away. He'd made his peace with whatever was on his face right now, and he left it there. "The supply room," she said. "Is cold," he agreed. "And too small. You'd have to move some things," she said. "I know." "In the main room." He was quiet for a moment. She was not talking about furniture. They both knew she was not talking about furniture. "I know," he said again, and meant the larger thing. Something in her face changed the last of the careful containment coming down the thing she'd been holding in place since the porch in the cold, with a trunk at her feet and no place left to run. It didn't fall away all at once. It came down the way snow comes off a roof section by section, until what was underneath could be seen clearly in the light. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." He nodded once. He didn't make anything more of it than that, because she would have found that suspicious, and he was learning her the way you learn someone you intend to keep learning for a long time carefully, and with respect for what she'd had to become in order to be standing here at all. Jonas found them 20 minutes later on the street outside his store, and looked at their faces, and did not say a single word, which was the most disciplined thing Caleb had ever seen Jonas Miller do in 22 years. He just smiled into his beard and held the door open and went inside to put coffee on. The letter from Arthur Briggs arrived in Millfield 6 weeks later, routed through Salt Lake City as Caleb had arranged, redirected to Hadley's office per standing instructions. Briggs had received the ledger copies. He had been, as his letter put it, waiting for exactly this documentation for the better part of a year. A federal investigation into Nolan Shipping and Trading had been formally reopened. Garrett Nolan had been informed by his own lawyers that a flight response at this stage would be inadvisable. He was in the careful language of a federal officer, not going anywhere. Hadley read the letter to them in his office on a Tuesday morning in early spring with Jonas sitting in the corner chair and the window light coming in flat and clear. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "It's done," Clara said. "The legal part of it," Hadley said. "The rest takes time." "The rest always takes time," she said. "That's all right." She looked at Caleb when she said it, and he looked back at her, and what passed between them was not dramatic, because they were not dramatic people, and the understanding between them had never required drama to exist. It had been built the way useful things are built out of honest labor, and shared cold mornings, and the particular trust that develops between people who have seen each other at the edge of something serious and held their ground. She was carrying his child by then. She had told him 2 weeks prior in the kitchen, in the same direct manner. She told him everything, and he had sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the unexpected enormity of it. And then he had reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, "All right." Meaning not just the child, but everything, the whole shape of what their life had become in the space of a few months in the Utah mountains, the thing that had started with a forged letter and a woman on a cold porch who refused to leave. He had moved Sarah's curtains the month before. Not away, he had hung them in the bedroom window, where they let in the morning light the way she had always wanted, and Clara had said nothing about it except, "They're beautiful," which was the right thing to say, and the only thing that needed saying. The tin mug was still on the shelf. The Bible was still on the nightstand. Some things a man keeps because they are the record of who he was and where he came from and what shaped him, and keeping them is not the same as being trapped by them. Clara understood that without being told. She had her own things. She kept a small photograph of her father, a worn accounting ledger from her first job in Indiana, a letter from a woman in Chicago who had been kind to her once and whose name she never mentioned, but whose handwriting Caleb had seen in the small stack of papers she kept in the drawer beside her bed. They were people with histories. They had brought all of them to this cabin, and the cabin had held them the way good structures hold whatever is placed inside them. The barn went back up in April with Jonas's help and the help of 4 men from the valley who came up on a Thursday without being asked because word had gotten around, and because that was what communities did when they were working properly. Clara fed all of them at noon and managed the supply accounting and caught an arithmetic error in the lumber order that saved Caleb $11, and Jonas watched her do it and looked at Caleb with an expression that required no translation. When the last man rode back down the trail that evening, and the new barn stood clean and straight against the darkening sky, Clara leaned against the fence rail beside Caleb and looked at it for a long time. "It's better than the old one," she said. "It is," he agreed. "The crossbeam's higher, more storage in the loft." "Jonas's idea?" "Good idea." She looked at the sky, then at him. "Caleb, are you happy?" It was the kind of question that would have been unanswerable to him 6 months ago. Not because he didn't understand the word, but because he had spent so long not allowing it to apply to him that the question itself had become foreign, something people asked other people in circumstances that didn't involve him. He thought about the coffee strong in the mornings, and the accounts in order, and the child that would arrive in autumn. He thought about the chair across the table, and the sound of someone else breathing in the cabin, and the particular quality of a silence that was no longer empty but full, that had weight and warmth in it, that asked nothing of him, except that he remain in it and not run from it. He thought about a woman who had arrived at his door with $43 and a trunk and a grip on her own courage so tight she barely let it show, and who had stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had decided in her clear-eyed and deliberate way that this was worth staying for. "Yes," he said, and meant it without reservation, without qualification, without the careful distance he had kept for 15 years between himself and anything that might require him to feel it fully. Caleb Mercer, who had built his life around needing nothing from anyone, had been wrong about what he needed, and the best thing he'd ever done was let a stubborn woman from Chicago prove it to him.